Hi, so I welcome you to this channel, and in this video we will be learning what is H2 database in Spring Boot. We will be going through the theory parts, the important aspects of theory related to H2 database, and then we will do a step-by-step setup like how we can set up and configure an H2 database in our Spring Boot applications. So this is an ongoing playlist on Spring Boot tutorials, and if you are trying to learn Spring Boot, you can subscribe to the channel and watch my previous videos. Okay, so let's just jump right in. So the key points that we will be learning in this tutorial are we will see what is an H2 database in Spring Boot. We will check out the advantages that come with using H2 database. We will know about the configuration properties that we have to provide whenever we are configuring an H2 database to use in our Spring Boot application. We will also create a simple Spring Boot application which will have H2 database, and we will see how we can run H2 database console in our browser, how to run H2 console. Okay, so let's quickly jump in to the first point. So what is an H2 database? You might have come across the terminology H2 database if you are a backend developer, if you have been working with Spring Boot, or if you're trying to learn Spring Boot. H2 database is an amazing concept when we are dealing with Spring Boot applications. So what is the H2 database? So coming to the theoretical definition, H2 database is an open source in-memory relational database management system that is written in Java. So it is an in-memory relational database management system, and also it is open source. And since it is an in-memory database, it relies on system memory for loading and persisting the data instead of physical disk storage. It is an embedded database which we can use in our Java-based applications or to run in a client-server mode. And whenever we talk about in-memory databases, we know that they are very fast as the data access is done from the system memory rather than the disk storage. And one important thing to note here is that H2 database, since it is an in-memory database, they are volatile in nature. That is, whenever we restart our application, in that case, all the previous data that we stored or updated, whatever we did operations in our database, all that data is lost. So whenever an application restart is done, the previous data is lost. So that is an important property to note whenever we are trying to use H2 database. And H2 database, we cannot use an H2 database for production applications. We can use H2 database for either creating POCs, or if we want to learn the implementation of CRUD repositories like the create, read, update, delete. If you're someone trying to learn the CRUD operations, you can use H2 database. You can use H2 database for creating POCs, that is proof of concept, and we can use H2 database during the development phase whenever we are trying to iterate through schema changes without actually making changes to our persistent database like MySQL, Mongo, whatever the database you are using in your application. Another use case where to use H2 is during the unit testing of my application. So let's suppose I have created an application which will be saving some data in SQL and also trying to read some data, trying to get some data from an SQL database. So in that case, for the unit testing purpose, we can always go for an H2 database, so that I will have the unit testing done on the H2 database first, perform the unit testing, check whether everything is executing fine or not as per the requirement, and if things go well, we can implement the same using the SQL or Mongo databases. So H2 is also used during the unit testing for our applications. Now talking about advantages of the H2 database, we literally have almost zero configuration. We just need to add a single dependency, add a few lines of configuration in the application properties file or the manifest YAML files, and then we are good to go. Nothing more than that. So it's quite easy to configure an H2 database. It is easy to use. We get a user interface on our browser. It is a browser based interface where we can see the outputs of our data, see the outputs of the operations that I'm performing, like the CRUD, create, read, update, delete. So I can perform all these operations and verify them in the browser in the H2 console that I get embedded with H2 database. It is quite lightweight and fast since it is an in-memory database. It provides simple configuration to switch between a real database and in-memory database. It supports standard SQL and JDBC APIs, and it provides a web console to maintain the database. So whenever I'm using the H2 database in my Spring Boot applications, the only way to run my H2 database is to go to a browser and feed in the slash H2 hyphen console, and from there it will redirect me to the H2 login page. And once logged in, we can switch to the interface of H2 console, where we can see the databases that I have created, the data that I'm trying to insert in my databases, and further operations. So now coming about configuring an H2 database, we just have to add a single dependency in my pom.xml file, the dependency of H2 database. So if you will see, this is how the H2 database dependency looks like. We have the group ID, we have the artifact ID, we also have the scope. And after that, once we have added the dependency in our pom.xml file, we also have to provide a few properties in my application.properties file. Like we have to provide the console enabled property and set it to be true. We have to provide the data source URL. We have to provide the data source driver class name. Also, we have to provide the data source username and password. And the last property, we have to provide the database platform, which takes the value of org.hibernate.dialect.h2 dialect. Quickly go through the properties one by one, and once done, then we will be proceeding with the hands-on, where we will create our simple Spring Boot application and configure the H2 database. So talking about the first property, spring.h2.console.enabled, which is set to be true. So by default, H2 console is disabled in our Spring Boot applications. We do have to enable the H2 console by providing this property, the data source.url, the value that is provided. Here you can see the mem is the name of an in-memory database, and testdb is the name of the schema that H2 provides. We can also create our own schema. We can also create our own database by overriding these names. Now we have the spring.datasource.username and spring.datasource.password. So whenever you are trying to log in to your H2 console, which we will see in few minutes, how we can, like how to log into the H2 console, you will be asked a username and password. So in that case, here I am providing the username to be SA and the password is set to be password. So you can always override these properties. Like if you want your own username and your own password to log into your H2 console, you can always provide your own username and password. Okay, so we are done with the theory part. We have learned what is H2 database. We have gone through advantages of H2 database, and we have learned what configurations I need to provide in my application to enable H2 database and to run the H2 database. Now let's jump into the theory. Let's see how we can create a simple Spring Boot application which will have the H2 database, and let's see how we can access the H2 database console. Okay, so first I will switch on to my browser and I will move to start Spring IO so that I can create a simple Spring Boot application. I have published an entire tutorial on how to create Spring Boot applications from scratch. So if you want to see that, you can find that video on this channel. Okay, so the build tool, I will use Maven. The language I will specify as Java. Spring Boot version, I'm using 3.1.0. And I will feed in the details like the group ID, artifact ID, name, description, and the package name. I'll feed all this quickly. Okay, so I've filled in the details, group ID, artifact ID, and etc. So now let's see the packaging. So we have packaging selected as jar, good to go. Java version is selected to be 17, that's also fine. Now let's quickly add the dependencies. So what are the dependencies that I need? First, I will be needing the web, since I will be building RESTful applications using Spring MVC. So I'll need the web dependency, and then I will use the H2 database dependency. So you can see that it provides a fast in-memory database that supports JDBC API. So just click on this, and consequently in the future tutorial we will also be creating CRUD operations using this application. So I'll also need the JPA dependency. Okay, so these three dependencies are what I need: the web, the H2 database, and the Spring Data JPA. So once we have selected the dependencies, I'll go ahead and click on generate. So it will download a zipped file, and once the download is done, I'll just navigate to this folder. I'll extract this folder so that I can use this in my IntelliJ. Once extracted, navigate to the folder and just copy this location. So we are learning how to import project, any Spring Boot project in our IDE. So just copy the location where the extracted folder is present. Now let's move to an IDE and click here to import projects. Alternatively, you can also always go to file, and in here you will find the option to import. So just click on this import. So underneath Maven, you will find existing Maven projects. Select that and click on next. And in here, we have to provide the folder location where we have extracted our project. So I'll just click on this and click on the screen. So the framework has detected the pom.xml. Now let's just click on finish. So it is importing the project. The build is complete now. Now let's quickly have a look at what I have imported. What all contents do I have in my application, in my project. So first I'll go to the pom.xml file to verify the dependencies. So we see that we have the starter data JPA dependency, we have the starter web dependency, and also we have the H2 dependency. Okay, so the POM is good, dependencies are there as required. Now let's have a look at our main application. So the main class also looks good. It is annotated with @Spring Boot application annotation. Okay, so now let's configure our H2 database. So we have learned how to configure H2 database. We have to provide in a few properties in our application properties file. Okay, so I have copied the properties that I need in my application properties file for configuring the H2 database. So we can see one by one. The H2 console enabled is set to be true. We have the data source URL, which is JDBC H2 mem testdb. So mem is the schema name and testdb is the database name. We have data source username and data source password. So username, I have left it to default SA, and password, I have set a simple password. So things are good to go. Now let's try to run our application and see whether we are able to run our H2 console or not. So I'll just go on main class, right click here, run as Java application. I'll double click on console. Okay, so the application has started. We can see that application is started. The Tomcat is started on port 8080. So we know that the default port for any Spring Boot application is 8080 unless and until we configure that property and override that in my application properties file. So I'll quickly move on to my browser and try to access the H2 console. So the URL to access the H2 console, it goes like this. First, the port name on which you have your application running, and then a slash followed by H2 hyphen console. So let's press enter and let's see what happens. Okay, so we get a pop-up box. So here we can see that the driver class is already selected, the JDBC URL is already selected, and username is also entered, which is SA. Now I'll quickly go ahead and type the password, and this password must be the same password which you have given in the application properties file. So here I have typed in password. Just copy this and paste it in here. Now let's go ahead and click on connect. Okay. So once I click on connect, we can see that we are able to access the H2 console. We have the information schema present here. We have the users. Okay, so this was it for this tutorial. We saw how to configure an H2 console in my Spring Boot application. So in this tutorial, we only learned how to configure H2 console, what is H2 console, and in the next application, we will create a little more complex Spring Data JPA based application, which will be using H2 database, and we will see how we can perform CRUD operations using H2 database in my Spring Boot application. Let me quickly jump to my tutorial. So we have learned how to create a simple Spring Boot application which will have H2 database configuration. And in the next video, we will see how to create Spring Boot application using H2 database and which will be able to perform CRUD operations. We will learn how to perform CRUD operations, the create, read, update, delete operations using the in-memory database, which is H2. Okay, so this was it for this tutorial, everyone. So I hope this was helpful for you in learning about H2 database and how we can configure the H2 database. So I will ask you to subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss the consequent videos. We will be uploading the full Spring Boot tutorial. Okay, so that was it for this video. I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.